Welcome to Empowering Plans, a show dedicated to identifying waste and undue expense in the health benefits industry, discovering ways to maximize benefits while minimizing costs, and empowering employers, administrators, and consultants to emphasize, once again, the benefit in benefit plan. Today's episode is brought to you by the Phia Group, empowering plans since 1999. Now here are your hosts, the Phia Group's own CEO, Adam Russo, and Senior Vice President and General Counsel, Ron Peck.
And Brady.
So guys, our podcast, the follow-up, the post-mortem to our webinar, I don't know about you, but our webinar, I think, broke every record. Correct me if I'm wrong. So welcome. If you're tuning into this podcast, the Phia Group's Empowering Plans podcast, and you have no idea what I am talking about, stop what you're doing. Go back to our media page, www.phiagroup.com. Hit the media tab. Check out our most recent webinar regarding the conspiracy to defraud us all. We discussed a number of PBM-based issues, some lawsuits that were filed against CVS Pharmacy, what our thoughts are regarding both, and the number of questions that came in following that webinar and actually during that webinar inspired us to have this podcast. So again, if you haven't listened to the webinar, please do yourself a favor and go check that out. Like I said, Brady, that webinar, I can't believe the numbers and the number of questions that came in following it.
It was a lot. Yeah, we had pages and pages of comments and questions. I mean, people are upset about the fact that they're getting screwed when it comes especially drug prices. I think that's the biggest thing. And this fraud that we revealed, this case for collusion that we uncovered, I think implicates not just the drug manufacturers and PBMs, but we sort of indicated that TPAs now might have some responsibilities here on making sure that they have good contracts in place and they're not getting caught up in this fraud.
So speaking of comments, I don't think we're necessarily going to spend too much time going through the list of everybody's favorite place to buy drugs. I think at least 50% of the comments were, hey, don't forget to mention this corner store, that corner store, this guy that I buy drugs from out of his apartment. But what we really do need to cover are some of the questions regarding what you're allowed to do, what you're not allowed to do. The conversation, I think, really inspired a number of people to talk about the ways plans can leverage coupons and the manufacturer rebates, particularly the ones that are directed towards the consumer to cover their out-of-pocket expense, and how that actually impacts the plan and its obligation regarding maximum out-of-pockets. So Brady, I don't know about you, but do you think that's probably a good place to start talking a little bit about those programs?
Yeah, that's most of the questions we had was about that. People asking about Copay Cards and what they have to count toward an out-of-pocket, what doesn't have to be counted. So the first thing to know about this is we did some research here and we've looked at the regs. We've been asked this question a lot, and it's our opinion that when when a patient goes to the register and purchases a drug and they are getting manufacturer assistance, which usually comes in some kind of a coupon or a copay card or whatever you want to call it, that the entire price of both what the patient's paying at the register and that assistance amount has to be counted toward their maximum out of pocket. The reason we think that is because of an HHS regulation which from a couple of years ago, which basically says that when you count who pays for a drug, they are counting any payment made on behalf of a patient. So in the case of a copay card, the manufacturer is actually making, arguably, a payment on behalf of the patient. And so we recommend that you count that entire amount toward the out-of-pocket cost. Now, that's obviously a pretty big deal, right? Because so for this year, the out-of-pocket rate is $7,350 for an individual, $14,700 for a family. So if you're all of a sudden counting a copay card of, say, $1,000 or $500 at least toward the member's out-of-pocket, they're going to hit that amount much more quickly. And so that's why we got a lot of questions from plans that are saying, hey, we either already only count the amount paid at the register, or we want to do that because why should that full amount that the manufacturer is assisting with, why should that go toward that member's out of pocket? Because it's going to cost the plan more money. Well, we agree, but a reading of the regulations, and especially we found the secondary source where it talks about Medicare and how that's how Medicare considers it. The subsidy that a patient gets on Medicare is counted toward their out-of-pocket as well. So we think that regulation requires that. That was by far the most popular question we had.
So if we've now determined that it's very difficult to, quote unquote, game the system domestically, the next question comes up, okay, great, then we're just going to send everybody overseas for their treatment. And one of the biggest, we'll say, resources that people talk about when it comes to overseas healthcare, particularly treatment of conditions requiring specialty drugs, other medications, and the like, is the Health City in the Cayman Islands. And I know a number of people have actually brought up the Cayman Islands and what the potential liability is there. And Brady, I know you actually looked into this. I don't know if there's something you want to talk about as far as that's concerned.
Me and Andrew Severio in our office have looked into this issue multiple times, and frankly, mostly him, have put together our response to this question. We've gotten it over and over again. And there are a number of things you want to be careful of before you just send your patients, your members to the Cayman Islands to get drugs. Number one, of course, is you might be violating a network contract you already have. So those contracts are going to require that the in-network cost sharing be the best available. And if your benefit is 80% and you're giving someone 100% benefit to get treatment overseas, you're probably violating that contract. So you want to make sure you're reviewing those contracts to that contract to make sure you're not violating it, for one. Also, if something were to happen to that employee when they're overseas, just note that the medical malpractice liability of someone overseas, they may not be protected by American law governing malpractice. So that could be a big concern. And there's still this, of course, legal gray area regarding importing drugs. So just know that there are very, very strict requirements that the FDA has in place. We need to review a program to make sure that those are being met. Of course, stop loss problems and other things. So just because the plan is going to cover these drugs that are being imported from overseas is certainly no guarantee, and probably very unlikely that stop loss is going to reimburse you for those. And then, of course, there's also tax issues. So depending upon how the other issues are resolved that we just discussed, it may be decided that the employer should provide the benefit here, not the plan, and that the employer is using its own funds to offset the cost of the patient, to the employee in this case, then that amount would be subject to taxation, and it would be taxable to the employee at the individual level. So a number of things. It's not so easy just to send them over there and expect that you're going to come back with cheap drugs. As nice as that would be, not the case.
So speaking of cheap drugs, one of the things that we talked about, and it's funny because it also ties into the whole conversation of incentives and which incentives can the plan provide, and which incentives would potentially violate the network contract, and therefore the employer has to do it, in which case it may be taxable. But from the employee's perspective, hey, I'll pay the tax because the net gain to me is still worth it.
Yeah.
One of the incentives we often talk about with our plan is the fact that we do incentivize people to purchase generics anytime it's available. And we actually use a carrot and stick approach where the plan not only waives copay, there's a $0 copay on generics, but the cost of the copay on a branded drug jumps when a generic becomes available. So again, the carrot and the stick. Some people talk about, okay, great, generics, I'm all for it, despite the fact that the lawsuit we talked about, one of the two lawsuits we talked about, the CVS lawsuit during the webinar, has to do with the fact that, quote unquote, they're upping the UNC rate for generics by not counting the discounted rate that they would offer a non-insured person. Again, listen to the webinar to understand the details of that lawsuit. People say, let's try to get people to use generics. Naturally, the next question comes up. Well, I'm most concerned about these high-cost specialty drugs. So are there generics for all of these brand new high-cost specialty drugs? I think the very fact that they're brand new and there's all this intellectual property rights, again, they talk about how it's an incentive for the research and development that goes into it. Generics are not necessarily available. Brady, I don't know if you have anything else you want to say in response to people who are looking for generics in sort of supplement or replace these high-cost specialty drugs.
Yeah, so we looked into this as well, and the question was actually, are there generics for all high-cost drugs on the market today? The answer is no, but there's progress being made. So I looked up some of the numbers here, and the FDA has an Office of Generic Drugs. Who would have known? The OGD, if you want another acronym to add to your lexicon. For 2017, they approved 1,027 new generic drugs. So that's 214 more than 2016. So that's a good sign. That's 1,000 new drugs that are cheaper than the brand name and have gone through the really, really burdensome process, by the FDA to get approved. But and actually another interesting stat as well, according to the FDA, generic drugs account for 89% of the prescriptions dispensed in the U.S. So we're halfway there, more than halfway there. We're 89% of the way there. The problem is that 11% that's left over are the really expensive drugs that are just killing us. And actually, one of the other comments submitted to us was about the case called City of Rockford against Express Scripts. And I want to bring it up because it touches on one of these most expensive drugs I think I've ever seen in just reading it. So I'll give some background quickly because I think this case is just really insane. And it's an example of a PBM getting sued for not doing its job. So what's going on here is you have the City of Rockford, Illinois, 150,000 people. They have a self-funded health plan, municipal plan, like many do, for its firefighters, for police, and for city workers. And a couple years ago, the city took a look at its budget and noticed something insane, that 2 babies were eating up 2.5% of the plan's total budget. So just 2 babies. Seems insane. So what's going on there? The problem was a drug called Actar. It's ACHTAR. So 9 vials of this drug that these 2 babies needed cost the city nearly $500,000. So the crazy part, or the crazier part, is that this drug has been around for decades, and it was just costing about $40 per dose, but the owner of the drug hiked up the price to $36,000 per vial in recent years. So pretty crazy that you had this important drug being used to combat, in this case, infantile spasms, which is apparently very serious but easy to treat. But this drug ended up costing the plan almost $500,000. And Medicare, this is even more crazy, spends $500 million on this drug. That was the most recent number in 2015. So here, the FTC actually investigated the manufacturer for antitrust law violations, and surprisingly, or rather unsurprisingly, it found them. And then they settled with this company for $100 million. But the attorneys for the city in this case noted that that settlement didn't actually require the manufacturer to change the price moving forward. Pretty crazy. So you settle for all this money, you can still keep charging the same price. And that's exactly what they did, which is why the city of Rockford is now suing the manufacturer. I won't even try to pronounce the name. It's some German name, I believe. But they're suing the manufacturer using the FTC settlement as evidence, but they're also suing Express Scripts. And the claim against Express Scripts is that they had an obligation, a contractual obligation, and now arguably a fiduciary obligation to negotiate the best prices for the city. And they didn't do that here, according to the complaint at least. And given the fact that this drug has been costing, for 2 babies on the plan, almost $500,000, probably a pretty good case against them. There's a massive law firm representing Express Scripts. So, high-powered lawyers, high-stakes litigation. The case is currently in the District Court of Northern Illinois, but we'll be following that. So thank you to whoever submitted that comment about this case for us, because I think this could be a turning point. The broader example here is PBMs have a duty to negotiate the lowest price they can for their client. Their client, in this case, being the city's health plan. And the problem, of course, is the higher the price, the bigger chunk that the PBM gets, either in a rebate or in some kind of kickback or percentage, whatever it may be. So the interests aren't exactly aligned between the two parties. And this is an extreme example of what can happen in that case.
And it's interesting you bring this up, Brady, because we actually, in one of our podcasts a little while in the past, we interviewed LG Hansel from RX Results. And one of the things that he talked about was really understanding what the role or responsibility of the PBM is, and how there's this misconception that they're 100% meant to negotiate on behalf of and represent the plan. And I think based on what we're seeing here with these cases and some of the contractual terms that we've looked at, it's actually not always the case. So I'm very interested to see also how this case shakes out. And if it ends up being determined that, hey, this Express Scripts didn't do anything wrong because they don't actually have a responsibility to represent the interest of the plan, even if that's the outcome, this plan will lose their case. But us as an industry, I think it'll be a bit of a wake-up call regarding, hey, look, this is what PBMs are actually meant to do versus what they're not doing. And, regardless of what the PBM's role is, somebody else reached out and asked the question, where are the so-called consultants? Why are they recommending traditional PBM, not PBMs that guarantee full disclosure and fiduciary standards? And waving this banner, and I totally get it that there's this outrage. I thought that we're supposed to be fighting for me. Why are the brokers still pushing these kinds of PBMs? And you brought up a good point to me, Brady, which is that, okay, well, what else are you going to do? The big boys, the big players, Optum, RX, Express Scripts, Caremark, whether you like them or not, and again, there's a lot of value there. Otherwise, why would the PBMs be there in the first place? They represent 80% of the market. So love them or hate them, it's the same reason why I'd say most broker advisors are still promoting some sort of a Blue Cross, Cigna, United, Aetna product as well, because again, it's the majority of the market. It is what it is. So if you don't like these PBMs, or you don't like those carriers or those networks, et cetera, you owe it to yourself and to your clients to educate yourself and be able to say, here's why I don't like what they're doing. Here are the alternatives. To just point the finger and say, hey, somebody should be doing something about that. Again, I don't think that's enough, especially when these entities essentially control the market. There really is no alternative. And if there is, bring some light to it. Speaking also of alternatives and what else people should be doing, I know people were asking about rebates in particular. What's the average rebate and what percentage do they usually see pass through to the plan? I don't know if you want to talk a little bit, Brady, about what you saw there.
Yeah, we looked into that too, and I'll tell you, it's hard to find a set amount in an average rebate, but I did find some data from an entity called the Drug Channels Institute, and according to that organization, about 1/4 of employers receive none of the rebates provided by manufacturers to PBM. So 25% don't actually get any of the rebates at all. Of the ones that do get rebates, they estimate about 90% of the total rebate dollars go back in some form to the plan. So that's not horrible, but I mean, if you're one of those 25% of plans who aren't seeing anything, not good for you. And they also have a number here about, one example in 2015 of a flat guarantee of $24 for a 30-day brand name prescription, that being the rebate amount. So kind of a small rebate, of course, per script that can add up. But again, that's sort of an arbitrary number, right? Because it depends on what the price of the drug is, and the price of the drug is set by the manufacturer in conjunction with the PBM. And as they're negotiating that amount, again, the rebate amount, we don't know what percent is kept by the PBM. Is it a full pass-through? Typically, if you have a good PBM contract, you want 100% rebate pass-through. That's the most common arrangement, but they're not all like that. And depending on what your contract says, and I guarantee you, if you're contracted with one of the big three, you're probably not getting as good a deal as you otherwise would be. And I think that's also why we talk about this in the webinar as well, but the administration has really been turning its focus toward PBMs. And I think the reason is because it is their job to negotiate the prices so low. And it's pretty catchy in the media when you see these stories about the EpiPen or, Pharma Bro, other cases of extreme prices. And, we'll look and see. The fiduciary duty threat is a real thing. I think that would be interesting to see how that would work with companies like Caremark, which CVS has its own pharmacy. So how could you have a fiduciary duty if you're Caremark, if you're you're basically serving as both PBM and pharmacy in that case? Same thing with Optum, right? So these companies that are sort of acquiring each other and other PBMs, that'd be hard to do. I think if they force these companies to list their prices and commercials, that would also be huge. But one thing that's not being addressed is the manufacturers themselves. And that's one thing that the administration promised that they would address. And we'll see down the line if they do. For whatever reason, for now, though, PBMs are the easier target. But until they can fix the problem of the actual manufacturers are setting the prices so high, I think we're going to have a long ways to go.
And I definitely think you heard a lot of the same conversations and issues also when people talk about, for instance, purchasing drugs overseas, right? The issue, I'm going to get all my pharmaceuticals from Canada because it's much cheaper there. Again, the manufacturers, like you say, they'll come back and they say, hey, listen, we'd love to charge less, but the money you're spending on the drugs in the United States ultimately go towards research and development of additional medication, new drugs, new innovation. If you want to pay Canadian prices, go ahead, but then you're going to have Canadian innovation. No offense to any of our Canadian clients or listeners. But that being said, these manufacturers are saying, look, we're operating in the United States. We're developing and researching and developing new drugs in the United States with the money that we're making in the United States. There's a reason it's much cheaper in those other countries. It's because they're benefiting after the fact from the research and, let's face it, the dollars being spent in the United States. Same thing happens here. So I think some of the parting thoughts as we go, and again, thank you for everyone who is listening in on our and downloading our podcast, the postmortem on our last webinar. Some of the parting thoughts are, one, yes, it makes sense to try and drive people towards generics, but again, listen to the webinar, whether you think it's true or not, the lawsuits against CVS, in that case, the fact that they're kind of screwing with the generic prices. Generics are not necessarily this magic oasis, this silver bullet, but That being said, you should still implement incentives to try and drive people towards them whenever possible. That being said, there aren't necessarily generics for everything, which is why you still need to work either with a PBM or directly with the manufacturer, the pharmacist, whatever. Along those lines, know what the pharmacist is charging. Know what options are out there. People were throwing out all these different options, from the small family pharmacy to the big wholesalers. Which ones offer the best prices? Which ones are the most transparent? Along the same lines, there aren't necessarily always generics for the specialty drugs, so identifying those who can tell you which specialty drugs are medically necessary, which are the appropriate dosage. Don't just assume because it's being prescribed and taken that it's the appropriate amount. The PBM, understand what role they play. They offer value, but is it the value that you think? Is their role to get you discounts and rebates, or is their role to monitor the distribution and make sure that you're getting the most efficient, effective manner for delivery of the drug itself? Who do they serve? Understand the contract. Don't just assume that their job is to negotiate deals for you. If that's not what the contract says, that's not what their role is. Along the same lines, are there entities, such as our friends over at RX Results, who claim to not replace the PBM, but supplement and do what you think the PBM is supposed to be doing for you? There's a lot that goes into this, a lot of moving parts. Just assuming that the PBM is there to negotiate really great deals for you, I think is a bit naive. Again, they have an important role, but understanding what that role is going to be the key difference maker. Understanding which drugs generics are available and which there aren't, and how to react in both scenarios is important. Understanding how you can incentivize behavior, which incentives are allowed by the plan and which are allowed by the employer is important. Understanding which incentives and which programs maybe cross a legal line is important, and what rights and opportunities exist for the plan are key as well. And I think we've been involved pretty much in all of those things, Brady.
Yeah, and also just be careful, again, with your use of copay card programs. Make sure you're counting the correct amount for the out-of-pocket. And if you're going to try to pursue in a program where you're importing drugs overseas, be careful of network contracts, be careful of stop-loss issues, tax issues, and again, the issue about medical malpractice. But we'll be watching these cases as they go forward in court, especially the ones against PBMs in particular. Very, very interesting, and they could lead to some case law which is favorable for plans in forcing these entities to get better deals. And if not, maybe we'll have executive action. I think the administration is going to follow through. They seem pretty serious about getting prices lowered. So whether that means commercials with a whole bunch more information in them about pricing, or that means some kind of fiduciary status or PBMs in the future, we'll be on top of it.
Great. So thank you again, everyone who's downloaded the podcast. Thank you, everyone who listened on the webinar. Thank you to everybody who does both. For myself, Ron Peck, and Brady Bizarro, we appreciate you listening in. Have a great day.
Take care.